The views and opinions of our guests are personal and do not represent those of their institutions or Applied Prevention Science International.
Welcome, everybody. We're allowing more people to come in before we get started. Nice to see some very familiar faces. And good to see some new people, new friends.
To give a couple more minutes for Zili?
Yes.
Do you think we should start now? For a couple more minutes.
Let's give it a couple more minutes because people always are a little bit late.
Okay.
It's nice to see that so many people are interested in this, and we have people from outside the United States as well as all over the United States.
Yeah, we have from Latin America, Africa, yes. Southeast Asia. So
Welcome, everybody. We tried to change the time for these talks so that we have an audience, more international audience. So I see Pablo up there.
Hi, Amy from Philippines.
Oh, wow. Nice. Let's wait until 10:05. I have different times here. What do you think, Maria?
It's 10:05.
Want to get started?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Applied Prevention Sciences Prevention Talks. Today, we are really pleased to introduce Drs. Bobbi Beale and Dan Flannery to our Prevention Talk series. Many of you who have been following us know that these talks have covered a number of topics that have been highlighted by the COVID epidemic. We've discussed the culture of prevention and what has to be achieved in order to support public health prevention efforts. We had Dr. Doug Coatsworth from the University of Tennessee Knoxville Center for Behavioral Health Research, who talked about addressing the stresses of COVID on parenting. Dr. Rebecca Hirsch from George Mason University talked about stress in the workplace. And last month, we had Peter Wyman, Chelsea Keller Elliott, and Brian Yates from the University of Rochester School of Medicine, who talked about the prevention of suicide. Today, we continue these prevention talks with Bobbi Beale and Dan Flannery from the Begin Center for Violence Prevention. This is part of the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western University. This talk is especially important to us as it is addressing a serious issue that we as prevention professionals must face in all our communities. But also it's special because Case Western University is located in Ohio, the home state for APSI. So a little plug there for Ohio. Research has shown that the pathways to substance use and violent behavior often represent similar trajectories for many young people. So it's not surprising that research has shown that evidence-based interventions are often successful preventing both behavioral problems. To explore these successful interventions and other work related to violence prevention, we have invited Bobbi and Dan to discuss their work and the research that they're doing at the Begin Center. Maria, would you like to introduce our speakers?
Absolutely. Thank you, Zilly. First, we have, as Zilly said, we have Bobbi Beale and Daniel J. Flannery. Bobbi is a clinical psychologist and senior research associate at the Center for Innovative Practices and is part of the Begin Center at Case Western Reserve University. Dr. Beale has over 30 years of practice and expertise in trauma, resilience, system of care, and behavioral health treatments for children and families, specializing in intensive home-based treatment and adventure therapy. During the current pandemic, Bobbi teamed up with Murray Long to adapt their AT curriculum for telehealth application. And Dr. Daniel J. Flannery is the Dr. Semai J. and Ruth W. Begin Professor and Director of the Begin Center for Violence Prevention Research and Education in the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel School of Applied Social Sciences at Case Western Reserve University. Dan's primary areas of research are in youth violence prevention, the link between violence and mental health, and community-based program evaluation. He is a licensed clinical child psychologist, a member of the graduate faculty at the University of Notre Dame, and professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at Case University Hospital's Cleveland Medical Center. And he has authored several and edited volumes on youth violence. Of course, you can refer to our meeting announcement for more information on their extensive background. Bobbi, Daniel, it is a pleasure and an honor to have you here. Thank you for joining us. Just a little bit of housekeeping for our guests. So we're gonna listen to the presentation, the discussion, and then you can post your questions to our speakers, and you can do it either through the chat, or you can raise your hands and we can give you the chance to speak directly to them, but we will ask you to be brief because we want to give the most opportunity to everyone to be able to participate. So thank you very much, and please begin.
Good morning. Thank you, Maria and Zilly. It's a pleasure for Bobbi and I to be here to share a little bit about our work at the Begun Center with you this morning. I think it's appropriate to just tell you a little bit about from whence we came and how we're sort of set up as a center, which really speaks to the kind of work that we do and how we do it. We came to Case Western Reserve University in the School of Social Work in 2011, after starting as the Institute for the Study and Prevention of Violence at Kent State University, also in Ohio, where we were a university-wide institute housed through the Department of Criminal Justice, and then eventually in the School of Public Health. And now we're in a School of Social Work. And you've heard that my training and Bobbi's training and many of my colleagues are clinicians by background. But this sort of disciplinary history really has set us up to deal with a complicated problem like violence in the ways that I think it needs to be dealt with, which is in a very applied, community-based, multidisciplinary way, because no single issue related to violence is going to help us effectively prevent it. So let me show you a little bit about the kinds of areas that we work in. The Begun Center, next slide, Bobbi, is really, my background is in youth and families as a clinical child person, but we do work across the developmental spectrum and across systems. We work in the justice system, we work with law enforcement, we work in schools, we work with our treatment providers in the community, we work with re-entry, and we have several major initiatives, two of which I'll talk briefly about today in the heroin opiate overdose epidemic and a large community collaborative effort funded by our Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. And we have several projects in the sexual assault kit space, working with victim advocates and prosecutors and investigators and the medical examiner doing DNA testing of old sexual assault kits to bring justice to women particularly, but also men whose cases of sexual assault from 25 years ago were not originally investigated as they should have been. So that's, the Begun Center is unique in that we are working not just through one particular discipline. We're not just public health oriented or education oriented or criminal justice oriented. We do truly work across multiple systems at multiple levels. And this really becomes a key theme of our work, and I think an important strategy of how we've been able to make some progress in this space. The actual structure of the Begun Center, next slide, Bobbi, is important to just share with you. So we are now approximately 70 research staff and students at the center. And we have several centers of excellence, of which Bobbi's part of the Center for Innovative Practices. These are training and technical assistance centers that focus on effective evidence-based programs, the implementation and fidelity and training related to those practices. We have both of the centers of excellence in the state of Ohio, the Center for Innovative Practices for Youth and Families, and the Center for Evidence-Based Practices for Adults. We also have PERI, which is an effort in collaboration with our local foundations to provide support to smaller nonprofit organizations to improve their capacity to gather information and demonstrate impacts and outcomes of their own programs. So that's sort of an infrastructure evaluation initiative where we provide services at a reduced rate, given that we have foundation support for much of that work. And then Bobbi will be talking in more detail about a new center of excellence, which is a statewide new center for child and adolescent behavioral health, funded by the state, that is going to eventually serve 50,000 children per year in providing evidence-based treatment programs, particularly for multi-system involved youth. Those centers around training and technical assistance and policy make up about a third of the center. The rest of the team at the center is focused on various research and evaluation projects. Again, some of which I'll talk about. So what are some of the things that really drive what we do and how we do it, that show us the ways that violence can be prevented? One of the things that I talk about that I think is an important characteristic of how we approach things is that when we work with people in the community, one of the first questions we ask them is, what can we do for you? Or how can we be helpful to you? What do you need from us? Which is a very different approach than approaching a prosecutor, a medical examiner, a treatment provider, and saying, here are my ideas for what I want to do with research. Can you just give me your data? Because this is what I want to do. I've been in meetings with medical examiners who are having conversations like this with academic colleagues, and they leave the meeting and they say, why in the world would I go over and above to just hand over my data, which, by the way, is very sensitive and political and HIPAA protected, just because they want to do something that has no benefit to me whatsoever. So this really guides a lot of our work, right? We're not the ones that come in and tell someone else what they need to do, or even necessarily how they might need to do it. But we start with the question of, how can we be helpful to you? How can we identify impacts and outcomes that you're already focused on, that then we can fit within an evidence-based practice, protocol, mechanisms around the work that you want to do, especially around receiving external support for the work that you want to do. So we really, we're also very embedded with our partners. So we are not a center where we're mostly just sitting around working with large mega data. You know, a lot of people are talking about big data. There are things that we do with big data that are necessary in terms of gathering information and utilizing that information. But we are more often than not, when we say we're an applied community-based research and evaluation and training and technical assistance center, we are literally embedded with our partners in the community. We do ride-alongs with police officers because we do training with them. We are in regular meetings at the medical examiner's office. We are part of the sexual assault team of prosecutors and investigators and victim advocates. So we really take, if you don't know what your partners are doing and how they do it, then you're not going to be very effective in helping them measure what they do or demonstrating their impact. So there are a lot of things that I think provide context for the way we approach the issues of violence and how to prevent it. This really speaks to the, again, multi-system nature of the problem, the multiple levels that you need to work at to address the problem. This isn't just an individual person, but individuals are embedded within families that are members of neighborhoods. You have to take into account ecology and culture, for example. And we really do have a multidisciplinary team to try to address this. We have anthropologists, sociologists, psychologists, social workers, people in public health. We have lawyers. We have individuals who are intelligence analysts, you know, retired from the military or from federal law enforcement. So we really take this approach, as Zilli sort of noted, you know, the overlap between our problem outcomes, such as substance use and violence. And I would throw in mental health in there and behavioral health. I mean, these things all coalesce at some point and that you need to be thinking about all of them, even if your particular priority or the target population you work with is primarily one or the other, right? Anybody in criminal justice that has a substance use issue is probably also dealing with a mental health issue or a child welfare issue or a workforce development and employment issue. So you're not going to be successful if you don't take that broad sort of macro approach. As opposed to, as a psychologist, you're trained to focus on the individual and at best the family. I do think that with respect to violence, we are gaining a better foothold on the public health nature of violence and talking about it that way and trying to address it that way. So the public health framework of, primary, secondary, tertiary fits most conversations around addressing violence in all of its different manifestations. But it's also important to think about violence on a continuum from, sort of general issues. We have projects that are involved with bullying prevention and school-based social competency programs with very young children, all the way to, suicide and firearm violence and homicides. So there is a continuum of behavior that you need to pay attention to here. And the last two things I'll say about this for the moment is, well, maybe three things. One is that, we often have conversations about what are the principles of effective prevention versus programs that are thought to be evidence-based prevention programs, because not every canned program, and if you all recall, we've gone through this period of time where, there's a lot of discussion about fidelity to the program. And if you change one thing about multisystemic therapy, then it's not multisystemic therapy anymore, it's something else. And yet, when we try to generalize these things, like the OVIS or Kiva bullying prevention programs to other settings, cultures, or populations, you find out pretty quickly that the rigors of a particular evidence-based program don't always work with every population in every setting. So I think it's a legitimate conversation to have about principles of effective prevention versus programs that we think of as gold standard programs. Whatever you're doing, we find that it's important to implement these things with fidelity. So that's why the TA policy and training centers that we have focus a lot of their time and effort on, once teams are trained in that evidence-based practice, there's a lot of emphasis on assessing for fidelity on an ongoing basis to make sure that we maximize the chances that these things will be successful. One final point that's sort of a couple of things to keep in mind. We want to be at the table from the beginning in the conversation with our partners about what they're doing here. Approaching these problems isn't as effective when you're brought in after the fact, when your community partner designs something with a particular pot of resources in mind, and then invites you to the conversation and you say, you committed to what? for what resources, with the outcomes that probably aren't very attainable, that becomes a much bigger challenge in trying to do something with effectiveness and efficacy. So we want to be at the table from the beginning, you can't be at the table from the beginning without, there aren't always resources there for you to partner with your collaborators in the community to develop these programs. So you can't wait for the money to show up. And that's again, an approach that we take that says we want to be there at the beginning, because in the long run, that's better for us and better for you. It's not after the fact. And lastly, in this space, when you do these larger community collaboratives, which is really where we're at these days. So most of our work are these collaborative initiatives that require multiple community partners. You need to be flexible and you need to recognize the politics involved because those two things are always there. It's not so much developing your program on paper and then 18 months later when you get funding, this is exactly what you're going to do, because nothing has changed in the substance use space, in the violence space, especially with COVID and our increases in firearm violence and homicide. These things are not what they looked like 18 months or 2 years ago. So you need to be flexible, and when you're in the community dealing with these sensitive issues, you need to understand the politics are always there, whether that's the mayor or the U.S. attorney or the medical examiner or your treatment providers or the person that you're trying to serve in a high risk, vulnerable population. You know, you need to be careful about what you're doing there. So, you know, we are involved in the substance use field with our colleagues at the County Board of Health and the medical examiner and the county hospital system and many other providers in the community addressing the heroin opiate overdose epidemic. It's one example of our work that I can talk more about later if we have time. And then this sexual assault kit initiative, which we've done everything from cost benefit analyses to victim vulnerability to looking at historical offending patterns among sexual offenders to mapping and combining information that we know now versus the old redlining policies around banks and lending in different communities. And we even have an initiative around ODNA, which is felony offenders in our community are supposed to be swabbed and their DNA entered into the federal criminal database. And we found out that that just wasn't occurring for a whole bunch of reasons. So the one thing I'll say about the SACI initiative is that in our community, we were able to test over 12,000 old sexual assault kits that had never been tested for DNA. And as a result of that testing and investigating those cases, we've identified over 750 serial sexual offenders that were not previously known as serial offenders. And these are individuals who cross over their offending, meaning they assault adults as well as children. They assault known persons to them as well as strangers. And what we've also found when we started, we were approached by the local prosecutor who asked us to help them investigate to identify patterns of serial sexual offenders in terms of increasing their ability to prosecute old cases. What we really found was that serial offenders are actually more unique than they are similar. And there are very few things that actually are consistent over time in their preferences, whether that's in victim choice or place or the method of the assault. So we've really done quite a bit in terms of forming current practice and policy and how to engage with victims from sometimes 20, 25 years ago to provide justice to those women and others who just were dismissed, frankly, from the system early on. But this kind of work, you know, this multidisciplinary integration of training, technical assistance, and policy with research and evaluation has really led to this newest Center of Excellence in Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health, which does have these two components of implementing evidence-based treatment programs and gathering information on impacts and outcomes so that we can identify which kids benefit the most from which treatments. So I'll let Bobbi talk a little bit more about that new Center of Excellence as a manifestation of really 20+ years of working in these various spaces as a way to, I think, move forward in a better, more coordinated effort to address issues of violence and violence prevention.
Thanks, Dan. So as part of the Begun Center, we are a center of excellence for behavioral health care in the state of Ohio. And recently that got elevated with a brand new Child and Adolescent Behavioral Health Center of Excellence, which is really a very cross-system effort in the state of Ohio. It's been driven by the Department of Medicaid, but all of the players are on board. At the moment, the Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services are probably the lead player, but we are currently working collaboratively with the Department of DD, with the Department of Juvenile Justice, with the Department of Health, Who am I missing? The Department of JFS, or Child Welfare. And everyone is coalescing to say, wow, these kids and families that we see pop up in our systems at the at the far end, at the most need, the most risk, they seem to be visiting multiple systems, and we're seeing them across. Most families and children and youth aren't in all of the systems, but many are in 2 or 3 of the systems. And we have to start looking at the fact that how did they end up crossing all these systems? What's going on? And of course, when you dig beneath the surface at all, you're going to come up with historical trauma, current adversity, lots of poverty, and lots of inequity. And so all of these system issues collide around these families and these youth. And really that's the driving force behind establishing this new Center of Excellence. Because it turns out, I think the theory behind it is if we could get the right supports and services to these folks in a timely fashion, perhaps we could prevent further infiltration into all these multiple systems and indeed help to stabilize these families so that they don't have to be involved in all of these systems. But at the moment, they need them to do one thing or another. We are heavily in the behavioral health system in our Center for Innovative Practices, but our task with this new Center of Excellence is to really be the conduit to get all of the systems to work together smoothly and effectively. No small task. Everyone has their own mandates and their own goals and their own ideas about what their clients or customers or people need or should be doing. And so that's really the point here, is to get a structure, an infrastructure in there where we can all come together and collaboratively work to lift these families up and get them out of these very onerous systems. So Dan has outlined here, or somebody has on this particular slide, what the tasks are. And one of the things that is happening is that we're recognizing, as we identify these kids more clearly across the state, they do not all have access to the evidence-based sorts of services that we know would be most helpful. If you're in a more metropolitan area of Ohio, you absolutely have access to home-based providers and the wraparound process and different evidence-based programs, like I saw mentioned in the chat already, FFT and MST, those sorts of things. But when these kids pop up and they're from more rural areas and we make very good recommendations about what might be helpful to them, the response we're getting is, well, we don't have access to that. We can't find that near enough to us. We'd have to send our kids hours away to a city to get that sort of thing. So that's one of the things that we're going to keep recognizing through this center. And that's one of the points of Ohio Rise. You see that at the bottom of that slide. They want to know, where do we need what's missing? How do we expand that? And one of the tasks for this center is to help make these evidence-based and evidence-supported services statewide. And so while we're doing that, we're going to work on building a standardized assessment process and one that can be shared across all the systems. It's another one of the problems. You come to behavioral health, we're going to do this big diagnostic assessment with you, and then we're not going to tell anyone else about it. And because it's your HIPAA, it's your private information. But it's, in the long run, it's actually hurting people to be that locked down, and we have to figure out a better and appropriate and safe way to share that information. So one of the ways we're tackling that is to look at the CANS, the Child and Adolescent Needs and Strengths Survey, which is designed to be a communication tool across systems originally. And so we're looking at how to use that along with our diagnostic assessments. We also need to be evaluating the effectiveness of the services that we have out there. Dan mentioned this already. It's one thing to mention an evidence-based program, but you have to recognize the limitations of those evidence-based programs. They're evidence-based because they narrowed their focus of who they were looking at and how exactly they got services And then they say, okay, now take this evidence-based thing and throw it across the state of Ohio. Maybe.
Tu Sani, devi andare dritto e là, in quella stanza di là dai vetri. Ok, ciao.
Okay.
Would you, we're going to ask you to mute your microphones, please. Thank you.
There we go. So while I love the evidence and I'm a researcher at heart and I want that information, I'm a big fan of using the components of evidence-based programs that we know are impactful and packaging them in ways that are appropriate to your local community. And that's not always a popular thing for the evidence-based program who wants you to really stick to that fidelity. But we're going to have to think more broadly. And there is something about the core components and how can we have permission and support to manipulate those to do the right thing in the right locations. So a part of our job is orientation, training, coaching, mentoring around those services and seeing how do they work? How are they impacting the areas and the families that we're working with? I think that's probably sort of the 20,000 foot view of what this new center is supposed to be doing. And the reason we're still at the 20,000 foot level view is because it isn't fully launched yet. We are in the very first months of setting this up and working to gather a team to do all the great things that they have outlined here. I am, super optimistic because this to me feels like the first time in my career that everybody's working together. We're all playing in the sandbox more collaboratively. And this was in the works before the pandemic, but I have to say that I think the pandemic has fueled our desire to put this in place, to launch it and to work more collaboratively. And now that we've all learned that we can do a lot of our things virtually and online, that has really increased people's access to events like this today. And certainly to our training and our ability to coach people in remote areas and things like that. So, nobody wants to be in this pandemic still. However, it's data, right? We are learning what else we can do because of the limitations of this pandemic. I think the last thing I want to mention is that my pocket of expertise, if you would, is being trauma informed and underlining all prevention work and all direct care is self-care. If we are not trauma informed and understanding the inequities that exist in our system, the work is not going to happen in the way that it needs to happen. No work, prevention or direct care, is going to happen without an informed and healthy workforce. And so one last plug, self-care is the answer, folks. We are all mutually traumatized. We're all experiencing the chronic traumatic stress of this pandemic and all the other things that we own personally. And it's no laughing matter. And you aren't going to just, the minute they lift the pandemic, and as you've noticed, it's not like a specific end date, right? The minute this starts to lift, we are not suddenly back to normal. We are all going to have to take a close look at how do we manage in this kind of environment and take care of ourselves. I think awareness within the pandemic has created unprecedented opportunities for us. We're about to go back into wider social circles and back into more personal face-to-face work in all of the fields. And this is an opportunity for us to think very seriously about how do we want to do that? What's the best mix of hybrid work? What's the best mix of in-person work and virtual trainings where literally hundreds of people can take advantage of evidence-based information? And so think carefully as we step back into the world and how do we want to show up there?
Thank you both very much. We had some questions in the chat. Maria, do you want to go over those?
Sure. Thank you very much, Bobbi. And Dan, I think that's what you just presented to us. The approach that you presented to us is very comprehensive, and it's really an example of what we should try to be doing also in the area of substance use prevention, and how do we bring all the partners together. And something that you mentioned that it's really important, how do you know, you need to know what your partners are doing in order to know that everything is being done right. So we have one, Radhika Sharma. She works for the Apna Gar Inc. And she is asking if there is anyone out there integrating intimate partner violence prevention, and if you're aware of the segregation of Asian American populations regarding intimate partner violence, community violence, and suicide, so that we can identify whether rates are higher in Chinese, Indian, or Filipino communities.
I don't know the specific statistics offhand. We are doing work both with specialized domestic violence dockets in the court that are focused on high risk domestic violence, intimate partner situations where there's a higher likelihood of homicide and perpetration against victims, as well as on the human trafficking side, where, as you know, a lot of immigrants and minorities in trafficking as victims. So there's a higher prevalence of disadvantaged females in both of those populations. I don't know if it's a significant population of Asian American and women and others, but I know they're certainly present in those populations in this community. In Northern Ohio, we have a confluence of major highway systems in the northwest part of our state, where a lot of trafficking occurs, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking, which has immigrated, no pun intended, into our community, especially around high profile events. So this is an area where I'd say it's really in the last 3 or 4 years that we have a group called the Collaborative to End Human Trafficking in our community. I happen to serve on the board of that nonprofit. And it really has brought the providers in this space together in a more systematic way to address these issues. It's a space, however, that we still lack good information about who the victims are and who's able to receive services and what's best for them. What we do notice is that everybody responds to these issues differently, and just saying someone should get treatment or trauma-informed something in the 2 weeks since they've been identified as a victim and choose to seek services, whether that's an intimate partner violence situation or a trafficking situation, that doesn't work much of the time. You need to sort of wait for a victim to be ready to share her story and to build back her capacity and resilience to be able to respond and to survive. It's a good question, though. I think that's where the information comes into play as to what we do and how we do it, and how are we culturally sensitive and understand the issues that are going on in those communities.
Thank you, Dan. She also asked that in terms of etiology of serial sexual offenders, are there similarities in their life experiences and spheres of influence?
The data that we have available to us with the Sex Offender Project is mostly police reports, investigative reports, medical examiner data from the sexual assault kits, and at times interviews with the surviving victims. We also do have access to their criminal histories of the alleged offenders. So we did publish a paper on their criminal histories. There is a literature which says a lot of some portion of sexual offending occurs as an opportunity around other things like burglaries and home invasions, where a victim just happens to be present, as opposed to a perpetrator who seeks out a victim who's waiting alone at a bus stop or walking alone, at night without others around. What we find is that there are some specialists versus generalists in terms of criminal patterns of offending, with more people likely to be generalists. As I pointed out earlier, they're more different than they are similar. There is a small subset of offenders who tend to be specialists and do have a particular preferred victim or particular preferred method. But over the population of serial offenders, they're more different than they are similar. Unfortunately, we don't, in this particular effort, we have not been able to interview the perpetrators to ask them about their own life histories or underlying consistencies in their life expectancies. I will also tell you that their patterns of offending vary tremendously, meaning they might have a cluster of assaults when they were 18 or 19, and then they stop offending for a decade or two, and then there's a couple of other assaults later on in their pattern of offending. Sometimes that break is because they're incarcerated. Sometimes that break is because of life circumstances where they get married and have a family before they return to offending. But what we were surprised to find is the fact that they offend everyone. They're offending strangers, they're offending acquaintances, they're offending intimate partners, they're offending against children and against adults. That's more common than we would have thought when we started this whole thing. And again, when you link not just DNA hits, kit to kit across multiple kits to identify serial offenders, but if you look at DNA hits of previously uninvestigated cases with criminal histories of sexual offending, your number of serial offenders across a 20 to 30 year period skyrockets. It's nearing 1,000 in our community where we tested 12,000 kids, which to me again was a surprise in terms of the sheer volume of serial offending. So we published something in Law Enforcement Executive Forum with colleagues from the FBI a few months ago, which really said, look, you need to treat every potential sexual assault as potentially as a part of a serial pattern of offending, because there's so much serial offending going on out there. You can't take these cases as individual cases. So number one, you need to investigate all and not dismiss cases early. You need to test all as opposed to testing selective kits or really just trying to get the permission of a victim from 20 years ago to test her kit, because that information can be linked to many other kinds of offending. And the other thing is sexual offenders are committing all kinds of crimes. They're not just committing sexual crimes. So when you look at the cost benefit of if you would have investigated that first known sexual assault, just the ones we find out about, the crimes that you would have averted subsequent in the 10 or 20 years after that initial case are enormous, and to the tens of millions of dollars in terms of the potential benefits to the community and to the victims of crimes averted if you had done your due diligence with the initial assault that we know about. So there's a lot here to say we need to do better in this whole space around sexual assault, and not just the extreme intimate partner domestic violence cases where we're concerned most about extreme violence, but it's not the right word at all, but the more common types of sexual assault, they're occurring every day, and we need to do a better job of taking them seriously, investigating them seriously, and as quickly as possible. It's the only ethical right thing to do with victims who particularly, go and get a sexual assault kit because of the seriousness of the incident, and encourage victims to report to a system that takes them seriously and is supportive of them. Because we've also certainly seen over decades the system barriers to victims getting help and being paid attention to, especially if a victim is a member of a disadvantaged population or a vulnerable population, and they're not taken very seriously. So this is another undercurrent of our work, is that almost everything that we do, we're always talking about what's the impact of what we're doing on practice and policy. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to say that we can throw our data up to our local police department and they're saying, great, we'll just go ahead and change everything that we do and hire 20 more officers and investigators because of your data. But that's where the working from within the system as an embedded partner is different than taking the position that we're just going to pound on the table and yell at you when you're not doing something, as well as you should be doing it. That's again, a different approach. People don't know a lot about what we do because we're not always at the podium. And that's the political part of it, that you're sometimes, but I think we've been able to affect change over time that way in a different approach than just being sort of an outside independent academic partner.
Thank you, Dan. I have a list of questions to ask. One of the things I was particularly interested in is integrating stakeholders in the community. And I like very much how you've done that, how you set that up. How challenging has it been to reach everybody? Of course, in the United States, we have a whole sensitive issue about law enforcement. Our group, APSI, has been working very hard in trying to integrate law enforcement in prevention, and have been working with a number of groups on that issue. And we know they're struggling now. There are a number of, there's a group called Lead Law Enforcement Against Drugs that is trying to do prevention within the community as well as the schools. And of course, they've been challenged by everything that's going on here in the United States. And a lot of our prevention professionals in our training, we're finding that they're asking, how do you get the law enforcement to the table? And what do they offer? And I think your experiences, it would be extremely helpful if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. First of all, I think you need to offer something to them. So I've been conducting training with law enforcement partners here for a long time, here in Ohio and around the country, and do that on a volunteer basis. So that's both in the academy, that's in, when new hires come into our public housing authority police or our city police department. So, being willing to provide training, being willing to do ride-alongs to demonstrate your interest in what they do and what their jobs are like is certainly part of it. Another part of it is to develop trust with them. Our law enforcement partners are very skittish about opening up their systems or making their information available to others. So we actually partner with them. They're under our local police department is under a Department of Justice settlement agreement about use of force and misconduct. And we have a team involved with them around the information that they're required to collect and track and disseminate to the community. But we also have developed programs like what we call the Police Assisted Referral Program, which officers as first social responders that respond to both incidents of violence, but also other calls for service can provide information as well as referrals to a crisis intervention team that's available to meet with families, within the first 24 to 72 hours after an incident. We're heavily involved in the crisis intervention training models around how to interact with individuals that have mental health or substance use or developmental disabilities issues, et cetera. Look, there's no easy way. I mean, some of the most difficult trainings I do are with law enforcement, some of whom who stood up and yelled at me and said, this is all BS. And what are you here talking about, dealing with youth and brain development and de-escalation and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So with law enforcement, it's a bit of a slog because they are naturally suspicious and insular and protective and have their own particular culture that they're dealing with. So if we go through this all the time, again, with outside, colleagues of mine that I know approaching law enforcement and saying, we want to survey your officers and we want to collect, we want access to your calls for service data. And they don't know what to do about it. Most law enforcement agencies are not set up to do this kind of work. They don't have the data systems in place to do this, to provide information. They're dealing with FOIA requests and lawsuits and incidents that occur on a regular basis that they need to respond to. So the best advice I can give you is that trust is an issue with law enforcement. And so you need to figure out ways that you can provide something to them to establish, earn their trust. And that doesn't happen overnight. And it sometimes only happens if you're willing to get into it with them and provide your assistance and expertise without asking them for anything in return necessarily at the beginning. Even providing grant resources to them isn't always enough, right? They want overtime for their officers and task forces. They, what's in it for them? They're not just going to write you letters of support to collaborate because you want them to. And leadership changes all the time, right? So you want to have a relationship with the sergeants and the lieutenants and the captains, not just the commanders and the chiefs. So that's a tough one because it only happens over time. And this is our challenge collectively. You all know better than I do, right? Prevention is one of the hardest things to measure the success of, given that we always talk about start early and start young. Automatically you're talking about, youth and schools, non-voting, non-resource generating constituents. That takes a long time to get to the outcome that you're trying to move the needle on violent behavior. If you can't show them, the successes of some low-hanging fruit that aren't the end game, but are a realistic short-term goal that shows impact, then you're going to lose them quickly, right? The politicians are reacting to the next thing. They're not waiting for you for 6 years to do your research study to give them their results. And then we need to do a 20-year longitudinal study starting in kindergarten or at age 3. So these are all the things that come into play. I wish I had the gold standard answer. If we just did these 3 things, then everything will be okay. I think if we do these 13 things, we're going to make progress and hopefully move the needle. But one thing I say to my team all the time, right? All we can do is not be the ones dropping the ball, right? Things are going to happen that we have no control over, as long as it's not us. So that means we don't also want to be the ones going in and telling people what to do. Because once you cross that line as a therapist, as a partner in doing this work, and it doesn't work, then you're done, right? You told us to do this and it didn't work and it blew up in our face, and don't come back to me with any of your other hooky ideas. If you work with them and say, what do you want to accomplish? How are you trying to do that? What are your goals? And start there. And then we can say, well, this is how you might attain that. This is how you might measure that. If you're going to try to reduce truancy, here are some evidence-based programs that you should consider. Don't ask me to tell you, what to do in each of those spaces. And we try to guard against that. We certainly speak up when we're asked to provide input or technical assistance or training or guidance. But you'll hear me say that a lot too. We're not the ones driving the train here, and we shouldn't be. To avoid those trust issues, those long-term kind of blowing up in your face issues. So I know that's a lot, but every day's a little different around here, that's for sure. And it's very different from, having a 5-year federal grant that you write up in the solace of your own office and have a great idea and you put it out there, and 10 months ahead of time that you're going to get funded or not. Then pretty soon you're 5 years down the road and everybody's like, well, where's the work and where's the impact, and when are we going to find out about this? Our stuff is way more, 6 weeks is not an uncommon turnaround time from an opportunity to a proposal to, you know, start the work way before any resources are here. So that's a whole other thing. You want to work with a state or a county or a local police department, we're constantly 6 to 9 months behind the money, meaning by the time you get your contracts and things worked out in these large collaborative initiatives, not to mention the institutional issues that our own universities bringing up around liabilities and intellectual property and data sharing agreements and data security, you're 9 months into a project before you even get a contract doing the work. And then almost always asking for a no-cost extension because you weren't able to start anything on time. And COVID has thrown a wrench into all of that as well. So I can go on, but you know, we might all need another cup of coffee by the time I'm done.
I'm not sure if anybody else has any more questions. We're sort of running out of time, but I think you, Dan, you left it on a really great note of collaboration, patience. I think for prevention professionals, collaboration is extremely important. And your approach, I think, resonates with many of us in the field. Are there any other questions from my team or from the audience? Okay, I think we left a lot for people to think about. As I said, I have a whole bunch of other questions, but that probably meant for another day. I want just to remind everybody that the prevention talks are recorded. Please check our website for our past recordings as well as this recording, which will be posted soon. If you have any questions, please get into our on our website. Please ask us. We'll be very happy to reach out to Dan and Bobbi specifically, or if you have questions in general. And please, sometimes something comes up that you will have a question to ask, and it really resonates with everybody that's been in the audience for our prevention talks, and we'd like to figure out a way of getting that information out to them. We're trying to solicit or elicit information or questions from prevention professionals who have been following us. So please feel free to do that. Remember, if you know the old adage, if one student has one question, you know, several other students in the class have the same question. So we really would like to attend to that. Anything else? Maria, Susan?
Yes, on this about the questions, remember that we have the prevention nuggets that are these pieces of information about prevention knowledge and practice that we'd like to share with the community. And if you have questions that you would like us to address through the nuggets, please send us an email, just talk to us, and we'll be happy to respond and put out a piece on the prevention nuggets addressing your questions. And again, Bobbi, Dan, thank you so much. We got a lot from you, a great model that you have that we would hopefully be able to show again, and we'll be, of course, following up with you to see where things are.
Thanks for having us.
Collaborate.
Thank you. Good luck, everybody.